Hello everyone, welcome back to the School A. In this new lecture, we will be learning about compiled language and the interpreted language. We will learn what is compiled language and what is interpreted language. Let's see what all we will be covering in this lecture. First, we will learn about compiled language, then we will go over the advantages, disadvantages, and next up we will understand about interpreted language, its advantages and its disadvantages. Later on, we will see the differences between compiled language and interpreted language, and finally we will be seeing whether Python falls under the category of compiled language or interpreted language. So here we saw what all we will be covering throughout this lecture. Let's now learn about compiling language. Compiled language is converted directly into machine code. In the previous this lecture we understood about the machine code. It is a native code that the machine understands and executes, and it doesn't need any translation in order to be executed by the machine. This is very important point which provides a major feature in compiled language. Can you give it a thought what it can be? Well, since compiled language is directly converted to machine code and doesn't need any extra step or translation, it happens to be faster and more efficient to execute as compared to an interpreted language. However, there is something which we need to be cautious about when using a compiled language. Compiled language depends on the hardware and is not portable. Compiled language is strictly tied or dependent on the hardware or the platform on which it is executed, and it is not portable. Now we have understood a bit of features about compiled language and understood about its dependency on the hardware and its portability factor. Let's try and understand how a program or code in a compiled language is executed. First of all, a code written in a high-level language like C or C++, which are example of a compiled language, is processed by a translator software called compiler. Upon processing the high-level code, the compiler produces a machine code, and eventually the same machine code gets executed by the machine and we get our output. So here we learned about compiled language, its feature, and how a program in a compiled language gets compiled and executed on a machine. Now let's see what are the advantages and disadvantages of compiled language. Let's check out the advantages first. An obvious advantage here is speed. Compiled language source code is directly converted to machine code, thus saving time in the execution process. Because of the same reason, there are less CPU clock cycles which are used in the execution of compiled language program, and thus this makes the compiled language efficient as compiled languages are converted directly into the machine code. They tend to be better tied with the underlying platform or the machine, and thus we can have more control over hardware aspects like memory management and CPU usage. Now we have gone over the advantages of compiled language. Let's see a bit disadvantages also of compiled languages. Compiled languages are platform specific, that is, they are not portable, and a program written for one platform can be executed only on that platform and not elsewhere. Another disadvantages of compiled language is that entire code is recompiled for even a small change. Now this particular factor adds the overhead while making any change in the program or the code. So now we understand what are the advantages and the disadvantages in case of a compiled language. Now let's learn about the interpreted language. In case of an interpreted language, a program is run through line by line and executed one command at a time. Interpreters are the software which are involved in the execution of an interpreted language. Interpreters read and execute the program at hand instruction by instructions. After being read, each instruction is translated into a binary machine code and then executed in case of an interpreted language. The execution is slower than compiled language since it executes one instruction at a time. The execution time is slower as compared to compiled language. However, with just-in-time compilation feature, now the speed gap has significantly decreased. Just-in-time compilation, what is it? Well, just-in-time compilation is a method for improving the performance of interpreted programs. During the execution, the program may be compiled into a kind of intermediate native codes, which improves the performance of the interpreted language and thus also known as dynamic compilation. Now let's see advantages and disadvantages also. First, let's go over the advantages. Interpreted language are platform agnostic. That is, they do not rely or depend only on a single platform. They can be written on one platform and executed anywhere else. Interpreted languages are easy to debug as they are executed one instruction at a time. So it's relatively easier to find out which particular point in the program is causing the error. Let's now look at another advantage. Interpreted languages support automatic memory management. Wow. With automatic memory management, programmers, a user, do not have to explicitly or manually take care of memory management in the program, and they are taken care of by the underlying technology involved in the interpreted language. Now that we have seen the advantages of interpreted language, let's also see disadvantages. Interpreted languages are slower than compiled language since they execute the program one instruction at a time. Interpreted languages tend to be slower than compiled language, which execute or compile the entire program at once. However, as mentioned earlier, with the advent of just-in-time compilers, this speed gap has reduced to a good extent. Another disadvantage is that interpreted language need to have a pre-installed or dedicated virtual machine. This virtual machine will be needed in order to process the interpreted language code. So we saw what are the advantages and the disadvantages of interpreted language. Now that we have learned about compiled language and interpreted language, let's now compare them and see the differences between compiled and interpreted language. As we learned earlier, in compiled language, the entire program is translated at once, whereas in interpreted language, the program is translated one instruction at a time, because of the reason that the entire program is translated at once. In case of a compiled language, compiled languages are comparatively faster than interpreted languages, whereas in case of interpreted languages, they are comparatively slower than compiled language because they are translated one instruction at a time. However, I would again like to highlight that with the advent of just-in-time compilation, this gap of speed has reduced to a good extent between compiled language and interpreted language. In case of a compiled language, the output after translation is the native machine code, which is the final code that the machine executes. In case of an interpreted language, the output translation is an intermediate code or a byte code that we know it, which is again processed by a virtual machine. This brings us to the fourth difference between both the type of language, that compiled language doesn't need an interpreter or a virtual machine, whereas in case of interpreted language, we need an interpreter or a separate virtual machine in order to process the interpreted language code. So here we learned about the differences between compiled language and interpreted language. Finally, let's come to the big question: is Python compiled or interpreted? Well, Python is both compiled and interpreted. What happens in case of Python is that the source code is compiled on the fly. When I say on the fly, it basically happens internally and it is not explicitly evident as in case of a compiled language. However, in case of Python compilation, what gets produced is not a machine code but a byte code